Spencer Wetmore is a former Charleston County prosecutor turned city administrator for Folly Beach. Now she wants to be the next state representative for South Carolina House District 115, which covers Folly Beach, James Island, Cuba, and Seabrook Islands. I speak exclusively with Spencer for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Spencer Wetmore, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much. Close up from far away.
That's right, via Zoom. Well, obviously I know you're a mom, you're a wife, and obviously you're the city administrator for Folly Beach, but now you're one of the Democratic candidates for South Carolina House District 115, which covers James Island, the rest of the islands, and of course Folly Beach. Why now?
Well, I've been in public service for 10 years now. Started off at the solicitor's office, and I've been at Folly Beach for a little over 6 years now. And I just really felt like this was the time to take that local government experience up to the next level and see if I couldn't, try to make a difference up there.
As a matter of fact, you said this quote on your website: "I'll work with anyone from either party to tackle our state's growing problems like I did as a prosecutor and at City Hall." You talk about the state growing problems. What are the growing problems right now in House District 115?
Well, I just think we're being overdeveloped. We've got a lot of people moving here, and that's great if we plan for it. And so one of the things I really want to work on is making sure that we are working with our local governments and our county governments to ensure that we're planning for this growth. Traffic, flooding, how are we making sure that we are maintaining the character of our existing neighborhoods and these families that have been here forever and ever, and making sure that that character is retained as we grow. And so those are the kinds of challenges I think that I'm well equipped to face.
How do you protect that character with smart growth?
Right. Well, excuse me. Sorry. So, I think that it's a matter, so I'm a little bit of a land use nerd. My mom has been a county planner my whole life, so I come by it honestly growing up going to zoning meetings. But I really believe that you have to, first you got to look at how Mother Nature designed the area. Obviously, we are a very low-lying district with a lot of islands and a lot of natural floodplains. So I think you start with that, and you work in where you're going to have, hey, this is an area that needs to be single family zoned because it's a natural floodplain. This is a lot of marsh, and so this is an area where we need to have enough space for the water to go. Or by contrast, this is an area where we can support more dense development because of course affordable housing and density have to you have to balance those things in. You can't just have single family housing if you want to have affordable housing. So you've got to also identify areas that are suitable for higher density development. And I am a big believer in mass transit. I think you've got to plan for those areas by putting in accessible, good mass transit hubs there. The stormwater infrastructure has got to come first. I also hope that we can plan for things like pedestrian sidewalks, bike lanes. I know that that's part of the challenge of being a district of islands is that you don't always have enough space to do everything that you want to do. But I do believe that, before the development comes in is the time to sort of identify what you want it to look like so that then you have a plan in place when that property owner comes in, with a permit application.
What is responsible development?
It's different it can be different for different parts of the community. Some areas of the community, like I've said, that are natural floodplains or that are outside the urban growth boundary, so on Johns Island and things like that. I think responsible development in that area is a lot lower density, and it's respecting the rural character of the area. But by contrast, closer into the peninsula, areas that have been more commercial, as we're looking at these stormwater infrastructure projects like the one they just did on the Muni golf course,
right.
Can we then build on that to make up the road? Can we study that? Is that an area that can support it? So it's really just working. You start with the plan and then the development, not the other way around.
And what other areas would you study right now for 115?
In terms of development or just in general?
Yes, ma'am, the development.
So I think you have, I think those are the big ones. If you can get your infrastructure, your traffic, your stormwater, your pedestrian and bike infrastructure in there, those are, I think, the priorities from my perspective in terms of what kind of development things you need, what you, the precedence, I guess, before you develop. But I think you also have to be looking at your green space, your parks. We're really fortunate on Folly to sort of be surrounded by county parks and the beach, and we've got a couple of really great playgrounds in the Folly River Park. Yes. And that is an opportunity for neighbors to come together, right? Like that's how neighbors build community, is when they can use these shared public spaces. So the Charleston County Greenbelt program is a great example. The town of James Island has done a lot of great work down at Pinckney Park. And I think just building on that so that communities have a shared space to use for farmers markets and events. I think that's a really special part of development as well.
And obviously in this conversation, you just talked about connectivity. Talk to me about the state of public transportation. How does that look in 5 years in 115?
Well, I hope it looks a lot better than it looks now. That's one of the things I really want to prioritize. I participated with the Charleston County, the COG, the Council of Governments, right, in some of the long-range transportation planning meetings. And one of the things I was very intentional about was separating out mass transit so that when we ranked it and when the public had a chance to weigh in on that, mass transit needs to stand alone as something that we consider and prioritize. And so, they have a rapid transit program, but what we need is we have a great framework for our existing bus routes. They just sort of optimized it, I guess, or reworked it down Folly Road so that it would be more efficient and get it all the way to Sol Agree. The mayor and I actually worked with the COG to work towards a hospitality shuttle that would also be available. I think you wonder, okay, well, is there going to be the interest? But you just have to build it first, right? You can't let the tail wag the dog on that one. It's another example of responsible planning. And so I think the mass transit is not great. I hope that 5 years from now, every time we redo an intersection or implement the Rethink Folly Road program with the grant funding, I love that they did a pull-off spot for buses right there at Camp and Folly. There's a reasonable bus shelter, but we've got to be building on a platform of technology as well. People need to know when the next bus is coming, how far away it is. These are just all these sorts of things so that you can use so you can use mass transit in a way that, hey, I know what time I have to be at work. People wake up incredibly early just to make sure that they get there because you don't know exactly when the bus is going to come, and that's not serving the needs of our community.
You talk about that transportation. Where is the infrastructure
in terms of
transportation?
Well, so you said where or when?
Oh, the transportation infrastructure.
Well, I think that I've talked about this a lot. This isn't necessarily for Folly Road, but if you do ever widen a road, so for example, I-26, I think that it's very important that all of those, anytime you do any kind of road construction, that we're also considering separate lanes for buses and high occupancy vehicles. So, as we know from our more populated cities, generally up north, but even in Nashville and other places that I've lived, as you get more urban, these are just, you have to be planning for these kinds of things. Folly has been asking for a long time in the same long-range transportation plan to have a third lane. Now, it always comes with a balance because widening the causeway means that there's marsh infill. But if you just build one additional lane there, that would give you the opportunity to have it transition so that in the mornings when the traffic is coming out to the beach, it goes out. Remember the old Cooper River Bridge and how there were like the little green arrows so you knew like this one's red and this one's green, right, along those lines. So in the morning it's out, it goes out to the beach, and in the afternoons it comes back, and that makes the bus travel. People are incentivized to use it if it can get you there faster than sitting in a car by yourself in the other lane. So those are the kinds of examples of infrastructure. Now the I guess they brought in the consultant and they studied different kinds of mass transit. So they evidently this bus rapid transit, came out to be the most cost effective rather than building the infrastructure for the rail. Now, again, wasn't exactly in the meat and potatoes of that piece of it, so I don't know if that wasn't, why that option exactly was selected, but I certainly understand the impulse to build on what you have, keep improving it. We have a funding problem, and so if that means that it gets done in a year or 2 years, I think we should still be planning for rail. When I first talked about running for this seat, one of the things I was really nervous about was going back and forth to Columbia. It's a long drive. It doesn't feel like a very efficient thing to do. And so I was looking up to see whether or not that the Amtrak would be an option. And there's no route from Charleston to Columbia. The Greyhound actually stops in the middle. It's really, it's difficult. And, even our neighbor to the North Carolina, has got, a rail system between cities. So even if the rail system didn't go within Charleston, which, again, I understand if they feel like the bus was the better way to do that, that connectivity, so to say, well, you can take the bus rapid transit or the hospitality shuttle or however we're going to, make these hubs, and you connect them by hubs, and then one of those hubs needs to connect to rail to actually have an ability to travel.
You talk about that funding problem. How much funding problems is there when it comes to transportation?
Well, a lot. So I think that is one of the problems with being a state that believes that you don't have to pay for things. So we do have to pay for things, and that means that property taxes and businesses and all of us have to pay for those projects. So, we had the gas tax increase. Even with that, we still have the lowest gas tax of any of our neighboring states. It makes a lot of sense to me that the people who drive on the roads would be the ones to pay for the road maintenance and the road projects. But no, we don't have enough funding for all these projects. Now, as DOT increases that gas tax and is able to do some of the rural work that's been a safety priority in their planning for the first 5 years of the project, I hope that they'll be able to turn, and look at more congestion-based projects. Right now, they're pretty much focused on the rural safety. And unfortunately, congestion and mass transit just didn't even make the list. When I heard Secretary Hall speak on that, I actually asked her about mass transit at one of the COG meetings, because it was disappointing to me that a region that pays so much of that gas tax and supports so much of that tourism, the burden of that tourism, was seeing so little of the dollars come back in the form of congestion and mass transit. So,
and how much money is 115 getting back from Columbia these days?
Well, it depends. So one of the things that the state is doing is setting aside money for beach renourishment projects. I obviously spend a lot of time thinking about that at Folly. So every dollar you put into a beach renourishment project generates about $37 in return. That's in federal, state, local taxes. Obviously, tourism is the state's leading economy. And so that, I guess most of the tourism is the surveys indicate that most tourists are coming to South Carolina, and they list the beach as one of their top reasons that they're coming. So they have been good about funding beach nourishment. So for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been seeing set-asides into a beach renourishment fund. They had indicated support for some flood projects, although then I never really actually saw the money, so I don't know. I don't know if that's still in the works. I think that James Island has had a struggle actually getting some of their funding requests met. So we all see there's a local government, the local government fund, which indicates that 4% of the GDP from the prior year comes back to the municipalities. So for example, Folly Beach's share of that is like $67,000. So not a lot. And that's one of the things that I really want to work to change. We're supporting this huge, heavy burden of tourism and then not really seeing those funds come back into our roads and our schools. So that's one of my main goals, is to go up there and make sure that I'm fighting for this, this money that we're generating to come back into the system that created it.
And I want to go back to something that you just said in a moment, but speaking of fight, you said this to Carlene. You said, hey, I'll fight for our teachers and first responders. Where's your help on this?
Well, I think I was very glad to see that education did seem to be a priority for the legislature this year before it got cut short. And it does seem that when you talk with legislators on both sides of the aisles, that they were addressing education. A couple years ago, we saw some changes for our police academy, and I'd like to see those continue to be funded. We've got to be working on how we're training our officers, how we're supporting our EMS and our fire response. We've got to make sure that there are training resources in place, PPE resources in place. These guys have got to have the right equipment and gear. And those are ways that the state can support that. And I think that there's pretty broad consensus on those kinds of things.
Healthcare for everyone. How much will healthcare for all cost the average constituent in 115?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I've been looking a lot at Medicaid expansion and how that has affected other states that have participated in the Medicaid expansion. As you know, the federal government now, it was a step-down system, and at this point, they now fund 90% of the cost of Medicaid expansion. So the state of South Carolina would bear 10%. Well, a lot of states that have participated in the Medicaid expansion have actually seen a net savings to their budget, because there were a lot of when you have to fund hospitals, that they're unfunded sort of ER visits and things for the uninsured, state programs, mental health programs, youth programs. Once people are properly insured and you're seeing the Medicaid pick up the cost of the mental health or the youth advocacy or things like that, then it turned out that a lot of states were actually seeing a savings overall to their net budget. So not only is it in the public interest, it actually would not cost the constituents of 115 any additional money.
And let me turn over to something else that's obviously developing, and that is obviously what you just said earlier. We talked a little bit about the economy. What is the tax revenue right now for 115?
Well, it's a broad base of revenue. There's a lot of opportunity. So, on a local level, you've got your property taxes. The sales taxes go mostly up to the state. They come back in the form of property tax relief, 71% actually. So you sort of build on that base of property tax revenue. That and sales tax tend to be pretty stable sources of revenue. And then on top of that, you layer in your hospitality and tourism taxes, which of course are very cyclical and dependent on the economy. So those are the kinds of revenue sources that you don't put onto recurring expenditures, you put those into one-time capital and infrastructure expenditures. So as you build up a surplus of, say, hospitality taxes, then you set that aside for an infrastructure project. Recurring costs, salaries, ongoing maintenance, those sorts of things really need to be paid for out of the more stable revenue sources. So the biggest ones I think that we see here are on a state level: accommodations tax, hospitality tax, and sales tax. That's sort of those are the sort of pay-as-you-go taxes. And then of course you see the base of property taxes, motor vehicle, there's all kinds of insurance brokers tax and
right.
Inventory merchants tax. There's a lot of things, but those are sort of the primary sources of revenue that you have to work with on a local and a state level.
And you talk about those sources earlier. What are those sources right now when it comes to all that money?
Well, fortunately, we've seen a rebound in that, but again, I think one of the things we've tried to do at Folly is to make sure that we are really funding our operations based on those stable revenue sources. So over 70% of the city of Folly Beach's budget is actually based on revenue sources that won't change, short of a major recession and people aren't able to pay their taxes or something. But for the most part, those are fairly steady. Now, these cyclical taxes, that's where you have the balancing act with public health, right? So I was distressed to hear that we've seen one of the highest numbers of new cases reported in the state. Charleston County's numbers are still okay. We're not nearly approaching hospital capacity or anything like that. But so we did see a rebound very quickly on a lot of these revenue sources. But is that going to be sustained, or are we going to have to sort of dial it back in the coming months? I think still remains to be seen.
And you talked earlier about those flood projects that you guys are obviously trying to get money for. How much were you all promised?
Well, we had we had thought that there was a near $200,000 coming. So the way I guess the state budget does is, you know, they come up with their normal budget, and then whatever is surplus projected once they get to the into the BEA process. And it was supposed to be on the list there, about 200,000. But again, I don't, you know, I know that this pandemic has eaten into a lot of the state's surplus. We have been fortunate to work with Charleston County on a lot of these same projects. So we're moving forward on the projects. My hope is that the funding comes through so that we can do them more quickly. But we've been fortunate to work with Charleston County on the transportation tax and the TST and the CTC. So those are the two transportation sales tax programs. So we're going to keep moving forward. Property tax bills each have a stormwater, water quality fee on there. And so we doubled that a couple of years ago. I think we're going to have to really talk. I mean, it's $76 per property per year. I think that most property owners would agree that if it's going to preserve the value of their property, then, you know, that might need to be higher going forward so that we can build up a maintenance fund to be addressing these problems in partnership with the county and the state.
And in one word, how will quality life in 115 look in the next 2 years?
Gosh, if I'm elected or not.
I'll let the viewers, the voters decide that.
If I'm elected, my one word, cohesive.
Spencer Wetmore, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much, Quintin. Always a pleasure, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, indeed, indeed.